Welcome to F105, Force Integration, where you put all of these different concepts we've talked about the last couple weeks together. The first couple weeks we talked about strategy and where we're going and building our capability, deciding how we're going to solve problems through the .mo PFP format. Then we moved into designing the organizations with TOEs and MTOEs, the TA process, how many we're going to keep. Then we talked about how we acquire new material. Then we talked about PPB, putting it all together to obtain the resources from Congress to buy personnel and equipment and readiness. So today we're going to be talking about force integration, putting all those people we're acquiring or retraining and the equipment we're acquiring into facilities at installations to provide a trained and ready force for the combatant commander.
And when we're talking about force integration, there's really four main topics that we're discussing. The first one being the priorities, how the Army prioritizes its mission and its units. Next being the personnel and the equipment that is actually integrated into the units. And then the Sustainable Readiness Process, or SRP, which builds the combat capable forces for the COCOM commanders to use for those missions. And then, of course, we want to make sure that we include ethical decision in making in all the decisions that were made in the force integration process.
So what is force integration? It is nothing more than the synchronization in time and space of all the solutions that you see over here. The doctrine that was written in new FMs and ATPs, the organizations that we talked about, new facilities that may be built, all these different trained and ready for combat commander. But throughout this whole process, planning is always being conducted. What we're executing today was planned 2, 3, maybe 10 years ago. Programming, budgeting, and execution, the yearly process that we go through to obtain the resources. And of course, stewardship is always being applied. Stewardship as a professional of our resources to make sure that we're not doing anything to protect just our branch or our thoughts, but what is best for the Army as we integrate all these different decisions and solutions into the organizations.
So the Army prioritizes its units and its missions through a series of documents. The first document we'll talk about is actually not an Army document, but a joint document, and it's the FADAM, so the Force Allocation Decision Model. And this provides the grand strategic guidance for all the forces under DoD. The first Army document is the Army Resource Priority List, and the ARPL provides the Army forces with strategic guidance, and it divides the Army units into 4 categories for classification and priorities of resources. Then you have the ERPL, so it's the Integrated Requirement Priority List, and the ERPL is the operational guidance that provides the Army kind of the prioritization of missions, and the ERPL then becomes the basis of the DARPL, which is the Dynamic Army Resource Priority List, and this is the tactical level guidance, and this actually breaks up Army missions, well, it doesn't break up, but it assigns Army units by UIC to those missions that have been prioritized by the other documents. And so this will now take us over to the personnel piece of force integration. So we'll kind of look at the key players and personnel. So the 2 big organizations are Headquarters DA G357 and Headquarters DA G1. The G357 is mainly focused on the structure, or making the spaces of the Army. So using the force management system and the structure and manpower allocation system, they develop the structure, which we talked about in 103 Alpha and TAA, and then that feeds into the Army Manning Guidance, which is the G1's responsibility, which is the faces. So the G357 creates the spaces, and then the G1 fills those spaces with faces. And that's, of course, executed by HRC by giving us our orders to go to those new assignments. So as we said, the G1 has responsibility for creating the Army Manning Guidance, but the G357 needs to give the G1 information to be able to make that guidance. Some of the examples of things that 357 provides are the units that are projected to deploy, big collective training exercises like at the CTCs or special missions that those units have been assigned to. So they'll get those units that have those missions have a different priority, and then that's how the G1 prioritizes in the Manning Guidance who gets those faces. And of course HRC cuts the orders, and the commanders at all levels have responsibility for knowing where their units are in the priority list and also making sure they requisition for their shortages in personnel.
So let's talk about how this whole process works. The account manager is responsible for managing the account of the commands, either to be a joint organization, a division, TRADOC, etc. Then make sure Army priorities are met and that the requirements are validated. The assignment officer is responsible for making sure that the officers in the population are taken care of as far as professional development, education, those types of things. And they also check out who's available for each cycle. So they look at those that are available for the cycle upcoming. The account manager's looking at the unit IDs and their priorities and how many people they need based on movements, retirements, etc. Problem is, the supply is pretty much never going to equal the demand because of the TTHS account you learned in your reading. We don't have enough. We have about 13% shortages across the force in all organizations. So the account manager helps spread those out. So during the manning conference, they will meet together. The account managers and the assignment officers will meet and determine how they're going to fill things, how they're going to fill requisitions. That's when you may get a major leaving, but a captain promotable coming in, or a senior captain who's not even promotable coming in to fill a requirement. Once those are hashed out and the numbers of requirements equals the numbers of officers, then OPMD bills the requisitions, then the RFOs go out.
So now that we've looked at personnel, turn our eye to the equipment side of force integration. There are a couple key documents that we need to have understanding of when we talk about equipping and force integration. And of course, with everything, it starts with our National Strategic Guidance. So looking at the NSS, MS, NDS, and the QDR, and then focusing those through a Title 10 lens, the Army then creates the Army Plan, the 5 parts of the Army Plan that we discussed in F101. And we also produce an Army Posture Statement every year, and then the Army Budget Estimate. And those documents are very key in the PPBE process when going through and prioritizing resources for the different programs we want to execute. Looking specifically at equipment, so all those documents are then given to the Army G8 and the Army Assistant Secretary of the Army Acquisition Logistics and Technology, and they produce some key documents. The first one being the Army Senior Leader Guidance, and that goes into the Army Equipping Modernization Strategy. Now, the Army Equipment Modernization Strategy is primarily for the requirements, acquisition, and resourcing communities that gives a micro view of the desired capabilities and the investments we want to make towards those capabilities. The other one is the Army Decisions on Readiness and Force Generation is captured in the Army Equipping Guidance, currently 2013 through 2016. And this is primarily for the Army components, commands, and units. Kind of gives them that tactical level look, but it's about synchronizing Army resources against the commander's expectations. And then a third document is the Army Equipment Program in support of President's Budget 2016. This is published annually, and it's primarily for Congress and OSD engagement, basically saying, okay, here's the President's budget, here's what the equipping piece of that looks like. So these documents help prioritize requirements and also let the commands know what they need to plan for, what's coming to them in the near future.
So one of the things we wanted to just discuss briefly, and this is laid out very well in your reading, is how do you as a field grade officer in an organization, how do your shortages get filled? So it all starts up here with the organization making sure that their PBUs or GCSS Army accounts, those are the property accounts of record, make sure they're straight. Any shortages are identified, any excess is pulled up to your books. Well, that's fed into the logistics information warehouse. So the Army can now see all the shortages and excesses out there in the Army. The chief, a couple years ago in 2011, identified the Army Material Command as the lead material integrator, because prior to that, no one single entity was in charge of all equipping for the Army. Everybody did different pieces of it. So how this is depicted now is, you'll see the Army Material Command in this light blue here. They are responsible for equipment redistribution. That is equipment that we already have in the Army that is in the operations and sustainment phase of the acquisition system, that phase 5 we talked about in F104. So that's equipment we already have on hand. So as we're redesigning organizations or moving organizations, Army Material Command is in charge of the equipment redistribution of all of those items. Any new items that are coming in through acquisition, like the JLTV, or any recapitalized items, say Humvees that go in, or 5 tons that go into an Army depot and they're upgraded and then taken back to 0 hours, 0 miles. The PM does the distributions for those, but they have to inform Army Material Command of what's going on. That's why you got this dotted line here. So all of these distributions and what's coming out for equipment distribution, what we have on hand, and what's coming out of new production or out of depots, all goes into the decision support tool that you read about in your reading. And that's an online analytical program. It takes a lot of these factors on the outside and many more into consideration, and then it produces proposed sourcing solutions. Those are, an example might be, We're deactivating a unit in Europe, and we're activating a unit at JBLM up in Washington. Some of the solutions may be to take some of that equipment from Germany and send it to JBLM, or do we want to take that equipment from Germany and send it to Army pre-post stocks in Korea or Italy or in Southwest Asia? So they will make a determination where that's going to go. It's properly vetted with stakeholders, the PMs, the commands, etc. And then if it's approved, the materials are released for shipment. That's just routine. If it's a unit has a LAD mission, in other words, a unit in the 6-8 months is going to go to Jordan or Afghanistan, depending on their mission, the UERWG, the Unit Equipment Resource Working Group, at the Corps division level is responsible for, within their own assets, filling as much of those shortages for the unit as needed for the mission, and then any outside items they can't fill then goes back to Army Material Command to fill. So the UERWG will primarily focus on LAD units and then fill those shortages. Again, everything's done within Army priorities and within funds. That's generally how the process works. It's not fast. It's not perfect. This is only about a 3-year-old program that they've been implementing it, but it's working better now. As far as just at the strategic level, the Army Equipping Reuse Working Group, the ERWG, they do mostly the policy and work on ACOM concerns, like we're mentioning down here, the URWG, they can't fill on their own. But your role really as a field grade officer is to make sure your shortages are properly identified, items are properly annotated on the property book, and you pick up any excess that's out there so that the Army can then see it and then move those around to fill all the shortages you read about in your reading. So now we've talked about how we fill personnel and equipment at units. Also realize that family support items are going on, hospitals are being increased, schools are changing, unit training is going on. A lot of other things are going on within force integration that we just don't have time to discuss about in the class, because all we wanted to really focus on was personnel and equipment. But once that all comes together and a unit's trained to standard, then we talk about the sustainable readiness model. All right, for the sustainable readiness process, this is going to replace the old R4Gen that you grew up with, the train ready reset, and to provide a more stable and predictive levels of unit readiness as we go forward in the future. With less resources than we had during the OCO time, the Army's come up with the construct of 3 modules that units will be assigned by DA. They're very simple modules. You're assigned that by quarter, depending on readiness levels Army wants to keep you at or what you're doing as far as your missions. Those organizations that have a mission, that have been assigned a mission, be it a rotational mission or a training mission, to go forth in Africa to do a partnership for peace or whatever, those will be called what's the mission module. There's 2 different ones depending on whether you have required, if the mission requires decisive action or not. Those that aren't in the mission module will be assigned to the ready module. And that is where units are at a high level of readiness and they're training. They're trained to deploy for any contingency. They just don't have an assigned mission. This module is where the Army wants to keep the majority of organizations within this band of excellence. The third category or third module is called prepare. This is where organizations that are in redesign, reorganization, such as the National Guard Brigade out in Washington State, that's gone from an armored brigade to a striker brigade, or you're moving from one installation to another, or DA has just decided, hey, we can't afford to keep X number of units in a high level of readiness, so they assume risk. And these are by exception units. So those are the 3 modules that will be replacing the current R4Gen, and it will be codified into a current policy that is in staffing and will be out by January of 17. So here's the whole process of building the Army, kind of laid out in one chart. It does take time. This is the deliberate process. These are all some of the different major muscle movements that happen during force integration and building an organization, laid out here in blue. The classes that you took in F100, F101 is all the strategic planning. F102 and 103 Alpha, that's your force structure analysis, your capability development, what you're going to need. You document your decisions through TAA in F103 Alpha. 103 Bravo, the programming, budgeting, and execution is always ongoing every year, so to obtain the resources to do these. F104 is getting any new equipment that you may need. And F105 is force integration. That's this big red block. That's where everything comes together. People start showing up. The equipment starts showing up at railheads or the receiving points by truck. They're issued to the unit. They start doing individual squad, platoon, and collective training. And then they're certified by ForceCom as being ready. And then they're available and assigned to an SRP module.
All right, so the summary slide for force integration. Now, keep in mind that force integration is really the synchronization of all the resources that go into a unit, being the personnel and the equipment and the training, bringing those all together at the right place at the right time to be able to train a unit to go into the SRP process for global missions by the COCOM commanders. We also took a look at the priorities the Army used, the documents the Army uses to prioritize the missions and the units, so the ARPL, the ERPL, and the DARPL. Looked at the roles of the G3 being the spaces and the G1 being the faces, and HRC cutting those orders for those faces to fill those spaces. The three equipment documents, the equipping guidance, the modernization plan, and the modernization strategy. Took a look about how AMC as the lead material integrator actually puts the new equipment out there and then reissues equipment to rebalance the force. Talked about the SRP R4 Gen model, the three phases of prepare, ready, and mission. And if you look back in your reading, there's also a discussion about the deliberate and rapid fielding processes. And then, of course, through all this discussion, focusing on ethical stewardship of the service and our decision-making processes.
That concludes your lesson on F105.